Okay, I want to thank everybody for coming today. I've been looking forward to this myself for some time. As these are, we have two of the legends in our field here today, and as you know, neither one of them is a publicity seeker. And getting them to agree, even though they didn't know quite the scope of what we were going to do, was a challenge. But I'm pleased that they were willing to do this. And what I'm hoping is going to happen today is that we hear a little bit of oral history of our discipline. This is something that all three of us experienced when each one of us went to Harvard, and in different times. But in every instance, it was still a relatively small program there, and they had a lunchroom in the department, and people would come to the lunchroom if they were there and didn't have anything else going on. So people come and go, and but it was students, fellows, faculty, visitors, and it was one of my most vivid and best memories of that whole experience, because yes, you get into high-level discussions of epi methods and talks about a variety of things, but you would also hear from people about what was going on, what they had gone through, other people in the discipline. You would get these stories, and it was actually a real oral history of our discipline. And so much so that by the first time I met Richard Dahl and Ernst Winter, I knew more about them than probably their mothers did, actually. And I think what's happened in our discipline has gotten so big, and training programs have gotten so big, I get the distinct impression that that doesn't happen anymore, and people go and they attend the classes and they do the seminars and they find out what's going on today and what they want to do in the future. But we've lost this appreciation of the history. And quite frankly, since most people date the real start of cancer epidemiology, Percival Pott, with the exception here, et cetera, but mainly starting in the late 40s. So we really only have about 65 years of cancer epidemiology, and we have two people here who have been here in the discipline for more than 50. So we basically almost have, and within their experiences early on, they knew all of the originators and worked with them. So I'm really hoping what the atmosphere that's established today is to have them all pretend that we're all in the lunchroom on Huntington Avenue. And I've given them questions so that I'm not ambushing them, but I'm also encouraging them to take off from the questions, to use it as a platform if they want to talk about somebody or something or whatever. This is just a kind of a stimulus for them to get into a discussion. At the end, I'll also ask if anybody has any questions that they'd like to ask them from the audience. So with that as a long preamble, and from the people side of things, and maybe we can start with David, is that who were your most important mentors and how did they shape your career?
There was one mentor, and his name is Abe Liebenfeld, and I was assigned to him. I was a member of the Epidemic Intelligence Service. In my second year, he had requested someone who had a training in oncology to collaborate with him on a multi-hospital case control study of cancer of the male breast. And so Alex Langmuir, who was the director of the epidemiology program at CDC and in the EIS program. And D.A. Henderson said, we've got just the guy for you. So I went up to Johns Hopkins, and the chemistry between Abe Liebenfeld and myself was just absolutely perfect. And we did the study, and he persuaded me to abandon my notion that I would be a practicing oncologist and to pursue epidemiology and public health. And that relationship that we developed was sustained throughout my career and throughout his entire life, so that there were periods of time when he would call on me to join him. One exciting time was after I returned from the Harvard School of Public Health. He said, why don't you join me as a staff member of the President's Commission on Heart Disease, Cancer, and Stroke. And that was during the time when President Kennedy had been assassinated, and President Johnson and Mary Lasker were instrumental in putting this group together. DeBakey was the chair of the commission, and it was a visionary plan for really having regional medical programs throughout the country, biomedical research institutes, training, patient care facilities for these so-called killer diseases, and led to a 2-volume report, a legislation that was passed by President Johnson, but no funding. So it was in principle a visionary plan, and that we see developed through these comprehensive cancer centers as an example throughout our nation. Abe Liebenfeld was a visionary, and it's hard to imagine at that time there were a few iconic figures, Brian McMahon, Abe Liebenfeld. Those were the two principal figures that I can think of. There may be some lesser luminaries that I certainly knew. And Liebenfeld began as a person who was going to be an obstetrician, and then went into the public health service, went up to Roswell Park, headed up their biostatistical epidemiology unit there, and came down to Hopkins and created the first Department of Chronic Diseases, and then ultimately the chair of epidemiology. He founded the American College of Epidemiology, and many of the awards that we give in our organizations are in his name, you know? So we honor him throughout. But he was my sole and principal mentor.
And just so you can appreciate the fact that some of these names just roll off the tongues here. D.A. Henderson, famous for eradication of smallpox in the world. DeBakey, famous cardiac surgeon who published a case control study, but he didn't have the cleverness to call it that, of lung cancer in the late 1930s that totally indicted smoking about 10 years before Dahl and Winter did. So Joe, who were your most important mentors and how did they shape your career?
Well, I guess in addition to David, of course, the person that really encouraged me to go into epidemiology was the chairman of the Department of Medicine at Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center, whose name was Rulon Rossin. And Rulon was a thyroidologist. And in my experience, thyroid cancer specialists seem to have a special interest in epidemiology. And I'm not entirely sure why that is, but they seem fascinated by epidemiology, and Rulon was one of those. And my great interest at the time was in cancer, clinical aspects of cancer, particularly looking at the patterns of disease associated with cancer. And we would go on rounds, and Rulon would see the patients, and I was responsible for guiding him to see the most interesting cases that we had on the wards. And Rulon one day said to me, Joe, you're thinking like an epidemiologist. And I didn't know what to make of that because epidemiology wasn't on my radar screen really at the time. And so he encouraged me to actually go to the library and read up on things. And I did, and I still couldn't quite figure out what he was talking about. So, but he said it's the patterns of disease that you're always focusing on, and that's epidemiology. And at the time, the Vietnam War was heating up, and fortunately, David was a senior fellow in medical oncology at Memorial, and he told me about his experiences at the Epidemic Intelligence Service at CDC. And but what interested me was NIH, and so Rulon at the last minute, my tenure as a chief resident was running out, and he said, "You can't be chief resident all your life. You have to do something else, and why don't you go to the Cancer Institute?" And he pulled strings and somehow managed to get me in, although usually there was a waiting period of 2 or 3 years. So when I arrived at NCI, Bob Miller was the chief of the epidemiology branch, and he recruited me. And he was different from any other epidemiologist that I've ever met. He was extremely clinically oriented, and he sort of paved the way for someone like myself who was very clinically oriented, and to discover what the contributions I could make to epidemiology. At the time, there was many statisticians at NCI, lots of them, and they were all outstanding. But there were very few people who were medically trained. So, so Bob was really a very key figure in my development.
Thank you. So we'll start with Joe this time, the next one. Excluding each other, your mentors, and others in this room, who were the 3 or 4 cancer epidemiologists you have known, or 2 or 3, however many you want, who have made the most important contributions to our field, and what were those contributions?
Well, I think Richard Dahl really stood out. He is a towering figure in cancer epidemiology and in epidemiology in general. He was, along with Ernst Winter, the first to really pin down the relationship between smoking and lung cancer. And, but his contributions extended well beyond that particular finding, which is probably the landmark finding in cancer epidemiology. He looked into occupational cancers. He was really the first, I believe, the first to carry out a cohort study of asbestos workers. And he had other occupational carcinogens that he discovered. Radiation was an interest of his, and he worked with Court Brown to study the patients with ankylosing spondylitis and quantify the risks of cancer associated with that exposure. He had tremendous influence over the field, over cancer research generally, and this, just as an illustration, there was an experience that I had with Richard Dahl. He invited me to co-edit a book that he wanted to write on cancer trends. And it was hard to say no to any request from Richard. So I agreed to do it on one condition. And that is, he said that he would take care of all the European authors, I would take care of the North American ones, And I said, I will do it if you write the letter of invitation, because working with David on our volumes, I knew how difficult it was sometimes to get authors to contribute, and also to send in their manuscripts by a certain deadline. So I said, I will do it if you write the letters. And he said, I'll do it. He wrote the letters. Everybody accepted on the spot without any hesitation. And the manuscripts were on time, not a day late. It was just incredible. So that was I got to know him quite well during that time. And one other person I'd like to mention is Bill Hensel, who was chief of the biometry branch when I arrived. His work on migrant studies, I think, was so key to our understanding of cancer etiology. I mean, he really was so masterful in the studies that he carried out, and I think he deserves a tremendous amount of credit.
David?
Yeah. Well, I think it's not surprising that we would agree on those names. I want to mention another name. We only corresponded at a time near his death in 1991, and that was Austin Bradford-Hill. I don't know if you're familiar with his name, but he was an extraordinary man, and one who really, not only having worked closely with Richard Dahl in the initial studies on smoking and lung cancer in Britain and with British medical physicians, but his introduction of principles of medical statistics into the literature that impacted not only the medical community, but also as a young student. I used to read his textbook, as well as a series of articles. He wrote about 17 articles in the Lancet in the 1930s, and then published his first edition of the Principles of Medical Statistics. It's a beautifully written book, and it went through 12 editions. And so I thought that he had an enormous impact on the medical profession, which tended not to think numerically or quantitatively, and he kind of laid out in what I would call the introductory principles of biostatistics. He was one who also was a strong advocate of randomized clinical trials and how they should be used in making decisions about efficacy of treatment. Conducted the first trial of streptomycin and tuberculosis. He also, as we know, put forward these principles, guideposts about how we make judgments about causal inference. This followed after the '64 Surgeon General's report, but we often think and invoke Bradford-Hill's principles by which we evaluate data and the plausibility and coherence of the data with respect to inferential reasoning. I also want to cheat a little bit here, Bob, and list a bunch of names, because I think we need to really bow to the individuals who introduce methodology into our field. And we know about Nathan Mantell and Bill Hensel, Jerry Cornfield. Now, of course, Norman Breslow and Nick Day. I think also Ken Rothman and Sandra Greenland. I mean, these individuals have made enormous contributions to our discipline. We build upon them. We use their body of literature, and it has advanced our field into a rigorous science.
Great, thank you. And maybe we'll go to David again here, that other than the contributions noted for the luminaries you just discussed, what findings over the last 50 years do you think are particularly notable?
Findings. We're down to here, okay? All right.
It just links to the other questions.
Oh, sure. Well, clearly, the literature on tobacco and carcinogenesis, the literature on biologic agents and cancer, that was driven by the new technology that we had to to make compelling arguments about associations with different biologic agents. I think the Human Genome Project and the relationship with molecular epidemiology is an enormously advancing field that will, I'm sure, be part of the evolution of DCEG and as well as the discipline across our country. If I may also mention some other things that are important contributions to our field. The IARC monographs, a body of literature that have been enormously informative and helpful to us. Indeed, the IARC volume 100 that has a series of these committee reports, A through E, should be reviewed by everybody. It really brings us up to date about all the lifestyle and environmental risk factors. And I think the EPIC studies, EPIC, that are being conducted among the European countries, the cohort studies, this is a body of literature. I may also mention the health professional cohorts at Harvard have informed us enormously about associations. I can go on, but I think you wanted me just to do a few.
That's fine. Yeah. That's great. Joe?
What's the question?
It says, other than the contributions noted for the luminaries that you've discussed, what findings over the last 50 years do you think are particularly notable?
Oh, there's so many, Bob. When I got here in, which was 1962, exactly 50 years ago, cancer seemed like a black box. There was, except for smoking, the hazards of smoking, and particularly lung cancer, very little was known about the causes of cancer. And then there was a succession of epidemiological discoveries that seemed to appear. Part of it was due to the waves of fashion, ideological fashion that we went through. In the 1960s, the emphasis was on viruses. I recall the first week I was here, the only other person in the branch was the branch chief, Bob Miller, and he was always traveling, and so I would get calls. And one call that I got that really took me off guard was a call from the head of our virus oncology program who said, "Joe, you have to go to Green Bay, Wisconsin." And I said, well, I couldn't think what that could be. I knew about the Green Bay Packers, but why go to Green Bay? He said there's a cluster of cancer, particularly leukemia in children, and you have to go and get some specimens for us to look at. So I tracked down Bob Miller and said, what's this about? And I realized that everybody in the Institute practically was thinking viruses are the cause of cancer. And if we could only study these clusters that were occurring, or thought to be occurring, we would get the answer. So Bob gave me wise advice. He says, refer them to CDC. And all I can say is thank God for CDC. They have done so many things for us. And they were very good at studying clusters. I'm not sure much came of these particular types of clusters. And then, well, this was in the 1960s. In the 1970s, fashion changed, and it was environmental and occupational hazards. And all this time, genetics was really underground. There were very few people studying genetics. There was Henry Lynch studying families, one after the other, but hardly anybody was interested in genetics. 1980s, lifestyle took over, particularly diet, and there were debates as to what was in the diet that was causing cancer. Then in the 1990s, the genomic revolution occurred, and finally our basic scientists were coming up with tools that we could use in epidemiology. And And this was there was an explosion of work in family-based studies with high penetrant genes, and then GWAS, exciting findings from GWAS on the low penetrant common genetic variants. But then there were also individual discoveries that all added up. HPV and cervical cancer by Zerhausen, and this was followed up by epidemiologic studies carried out by Nubia Munoz and Mark Schiffman and others in our group. Hepatitis B, Palmer Beasley, and in relationship to liver cancer. H. pylori, of course, came as a big surprise, but that was a major discovery in relationship to stomach cancer. And then asbestos was a big deal, and estrogens. Thanks to Brian McMahon and Bob Hoover, we learned a lot about the role of estrogens in breast cancer. And radiation, I can't forget radiation. The work of Gil Beebe at the Atomic Bomb Casualty Commission, now called the Radiation Effects Research Foundation, the classic study of the atom bomb survivors, which still goes on to this day. So much. Passive smoking was, I think, a major finding because it really, in my mind, underscored the value of epidemiology, the power of epidemiology to identify low-level risks. At one time, we thought if it was less than 7-fold, it didn't mean much. Then it was 3-fold, and then suddenly we were down to 1- and 2-fold. And then GWAS also has shown us that with the large enough studies and replication, we could identify very low levels of risk. So, and the Dahl-Pito monograph, of course, was a huge undertaking, a tour de force, which sort of put things in perspective. And the Surgeon General's report in 1964 was a classic. And it was interesting because even after it came out, there were still people at NIH who did not believe that cigarette smoking was a real health hazard. So, and people in power at NIH. So, anyways, that's it, Bob.
That's great. Okay, kind of lighten up the conversation a little bit. This is in the personality area. Over your career, who were the most notable characters in our field, and what made them so interesting? David?
Well, you almost know what I'm going to say. Ernst Winter. Ernst Winter, when he was a medical student at Washington University, was approached by Ewart Graham, who was a thoracic surgeon, about doing a study on tobacco and lung cancer. And Ernst took it over, did a case control study, and published, while in medical school, in 1950, a paper that underscored the association. If we would take that paper and put it before students today, they could critique it, but nevertheless, the association was so compelling that it's hard to imagine any serious source of bias or confounding or whatever. He then came to Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center and was enormously productive. Ernst, who was Germanic in his manner, was flamboyant, charismatic, and at times infuriating. But he had endless ideas. The only issue was you pursue them. But he was enormously productive. Hundreds and hundreds of publications. And he would do these case control studies, have these team of interviewers within hospitals, particularly Memorial Sloan Kettering. He then had this laboratory that did tobacco carcinogenesis studies with Dietrich Hoffman and his group, and began to identify the chemical constituents of tobacco smoke that were carcinogens, promoters, co-carcinogens, and a body of literature came out of there. He was one of the early proponents of the concept of what he called metabolic epidemiology, which we have different terms for now, but where he wanted to bring the laboratory and the study of metabolites into analytic studies and hypothesis testing studies so that there was more mechanistic implications of associations that we were reporting. And he created the American Health Foundation, which was a basis for the laboratory studies, as well as these health educational initiatives that he was advancing. He had an enormous ability to get funding. He had access to offices within NCI in a most remarkable way to extract funds from our decision makers. And he also was not beyond bringing a Hollywood starlet into our professional staff dining room and saying, "Hi, boys." and this beautiful model would come into the room, and you'd keep shaking your head about Ernst Winter. So he was a notable character.
Yes, he was. Joseph?
Well, you know, David took the words out of my mouth. Nobody that I know could somehow manage such an active both professional life and social life. He was a bachelor, and he thrived on as David says, squiring very attractive ladies, and I'll never forget the time he walked into the cafeteria at Memorial Hospital, arm in arm with Kim Novak. And this, I mean, he just brought down the house.
Okay, but to lighten it up a little, didn't it? Okay, in your view, over your entire career, which non-epidemiologists have been the most helpful to and supportive of our discipline? And the second part of that question, if you choose to answer it, is similarly who have been the most non-helpful.
Did you want?
I'm sure.
Oh, good.
Well, I would say we've been very fortunate at NCI to have supportive leadership at the highest levels. And the person who had the wisdom to make our program a division was Rick Klausner, who was the director at that time. And I think we owe him a debt of gratitude. He was a basic scientist, but somehow he had a breadth of vision, which was truly remarkable. I think at the international level, John Higginson, also a character, and a pathologist who was the first head of IARC, realized that the opportunities for an international agency like IARC was in epidemiology. And he quickly assembled a really quite powerful group of scientists who were either epidemiologists or statisticians or interested in the field. There were some laboratory people, but they were all plugged into epidemiology. And so I thought he added quite a bit. And who else? Well, all the statisticians. I mean, David mentioned Bradford-Hill and Jerry Cornfield, Nate Mantell, also a bit of a character with his eccentric style, but a brilliant statistician who work closely with epidemiologists. So that's.
I thought, I was very fond of Arthur Upton, who was one of the directors here. He created the fellowships, career awards actually, in preventive oncology. I was one of the early recipients of it, and Arthur did some wonderful work in radiation carcinogenesis. I thought he was understanding of epidemiology, and I know he was supportive of work that I did, and I'm sure others felt the same way. You know, in terms of support for our discipline, I want to mention Oxford University Press. When you think of a publishing house that has promoted a body of literature that reflects the best and brightest of our colleagues, Oxford has been right out there and in a position of leadership. And I enjoyed working at that time with Jeffrey House. Joe and I did for some of the earlier editions of our textbook, and found him to be very helpful in facilitating awareness by Oxford of the importance of epidemiology. More recently is Jones and Bartlett, but I really think Oxford University Press deserves some recognition by us.
You know, most of them didn't answer the second part of the question, but they're much too.
What was this?
What was it? Who were the most non-helpful?
Non-helpful. My parents told me early on never to say bad things about anybody. But I'll say there may be a category of people. Some of them are journalists, some of them are lawyers. A few scientists who have magnified the limitations of epidemiology, which we're all familiar with, while downplaying the strengths of the field and the successes that we've had. And of course, there are scientists that have been closely aligned with special interest groups. Some of the scientists are very capable individuals, but in general, the truth always comes out.
Okay. So, David, what epidemiologic findings, either yours or others, were the most surprising to you at the time, and why?
Let's see. I think Joe alluded to one, H. pylori. That was such a dramatic shift in a paradigm of our thinking about duodenal ulcer, and then, of course, the linkages with neoplasia as well. That was truly remarkable. And then perhaps some of the inverse relationships with adenocarcinoma of the esophagus, which I'd like to see clarified. So what Warren and Marshall achieved is such a superb example of believe in what you believe is right and correct, and also anticipate that you will be vilified by the profession, not embraced by them because you are going contrary to dogma, and to have that ability to advance a concept that was very, very dramatic. I think some of the complexity of relationships with the steroid hormones has been very interesting to us. You know, it's like good cop, bad cop. Some of the associations with combination OCs have been dramatically protective for endometrial and ovarian cancer, particularly the endometrioid carcinomas of the ovary. And at the same time, the action on the on breast ductal epithelium is quite different than on the endometrial epithelium. Some of the conflicting findings about folates has been very interesting, you know, because of its multiplicity of effects, both on nucleotide synthesis as well as on the methylation pathways, and the timing as to when you introduce supplemental folates as to whether individuals may have precursor lesions, we may find paradoxically that there are adverse effects and not always the beneficial effects. Those are three examples that come to my mind.
I would say one of the most surprising findings that was the DES story, the discovery of vaginal adenocarcinomas in the daughters of women exposed to DES during pregnancy. This really, I think, caused a paradigm shift in our thinking about the importance of early life exposures, and which is one of the toughest areas to study. But I think this really set the stage for a research into the role of early life exposures, not just for childhood cancer, but for adult cancers as well. And then another surprise, I think, in my mind, there was always seemed to be a resistance to at NIH and elsewhere to looking at the role of obesity in cancer. And now we just see a remarkable array of tumors associated with obesity. And I think that was a real surprise. I think the geographic patterns, the discovery of tremendous international variation in cancer risk, and even our cancer maps, which showed a clustering of cancers around the country, and patterns that stimulated a lot of epidemiologic research. Burkitt lymphoma. I think Burkitt's discovery of a belt of lymphoma across Africa was a striking finding, and also paved the way for a lot of research.
Okay, Joe, this is kind of a three-part question. There's been a whole lot of changes in our discipline over the time that you fellows have been in it. So basically, I was wondering from your position, what's been the biggest change? Similarly, what's been the best change? And what's been the worst change? Now, they may all end up being the same thing, or they could be different.
I think the biggest, in my view, the biggest change has been the application of biomarkers and the move toward genomic and molecular epidemiology. This really required us to think more broadly about how to conduct epidemiologic research, and has led to large-scale collaborative studies in the form of consortia. The realization that cohort studies had so much to offer, and the Nurses' Health Study, and of course, is the prime example. And I would say the best accomplishments, and what was the phrase?
Best change.
The best change. Well, I think of the new methods developed by statisticians and methodologists in epidemiology has made our discipline more rigorous and robust.
How about the worst change?
I think probably the temptation to magnify risks that resulted from subset analyses has led to a lot of blind alleys, and again underscoring the importance of very large-scale studies and replication before publication.
David?
I certainly agree with all of Joe's insights. I think one development that's positive and challenging for us are the importance of interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary research that compels us as an epidemiology discipline to see the necessity of being able to communicate with and collaborate with a variety of disciplines and appropriately testing hypotheses. What this requires of us is that we are well grounded in fundamentals of these methodologies and understand the language of our collegial disciplines so that we are not a second-class player, but we're really a co-equal in collaborative research. And I think some of the directions that we are going in now in the teachings at schools of public health and training here within DCEG are important, that we not be viewed in a pejorative way as a kind of, quote, soft social discipline, but rather as a co-equal in doing rigorous scientific research and risk assessment. I think also the development of population registries is very important. We know of notable examples of these because they not only are the basic requirements for looking at trends and evaluating the efficacy of cancer control interventions, but also serve as a resource for the population-based studies that are essential for us in studying associations. On the worst change, well, it's hard to put as a worst change. The one thing I'm concerned about, this was something that Abe Liebenfeld was concerned about too, is that we may fragment a bit into different multiple societies that we're associated with, and that we find pharmacoepidemiologists, neuroepidemiologists, all different sub-disciplines within the overall discipline. We're all epidemiologists, and we have a methodology that we all employ. The content of it may change, but by doing the fragmentation, we dilute, I think, our visibility within the scientific community at times. So that's a concern I have about that.
Okay, and while you're still warmed up, David, what do you view as your own biggest professional success? And the flip side of that, what do you view as your own biggest professional disappointment?
The textbook. With my buddy. That certainly is a source of enormous pride. Can I go beyond one?
Yes, please do. That's a given. You know.
I felt very good about bringing the graduate summer session program to the University of Michigan. I had been teaching at the University of Minnesota during the summer, and when I became chair, I had the support of the dean of my school, and not the support of my faculty, I must say, to bring the summer program and the invited faculty to teach. And you know, over these years, we have trained and instructed and enhanced the skills of hundreds and hundreds of health professionals. And I'm really very proud of that achievement, and even some of my faculty would agree with me there. It was a plus for the Department of Epidemiology. The issue for them was, why do we have these foreign agents coming into our school and teaching? Why shouldn't we embrace the program on our own? When that was ridiculous, because the content of the curriculum there is so vast and so broad. We want to bring the best in to teach and provide even new insights to our students who, within our own program, take advantage of the summer program as well. So I think most have bought into it now, but I'm very proud of that. And you know, when Joe was very much involved with me in the creation of the American Society of Preventive Oncology, which was a recognition of preventive oncology as a discipline that crosses all the different component parts of epidemiologic science, and to bring together young investigators into a rather small colloquium there to have displays of their research, to have panel discussions. It was certainly a move that has continued to this very day, and I think has been a plus for cancer epidemiology.
How about disappointment?
Oh, disappointment. I think it gets down usually to turf battles, cross-institutional collaborations. I felt this in New York City, certainly, and even in Ann Arbor, Michigan, when I would try to reach out to Detroit, to institutions there was always that uneasy alliances, so that if I wanted to develop a broad consortium of us, there was a resistance between our community and the Detroit community. And of course, that's where the SEER program was based. And it was not easy to have access to that resource. That's been my greatest difficulty. I think it takes a lot of skill and diplomacy and endless patience and trust, and I was not always successful.
Joseph, your biggest success and
Success, I think with the help of a lot of people, developing a truly robust research and training program in cancer epidemiology, one that really covers the waterfront of etiologic risk factors, that embraces both genetic and environmental factors, and having a working hypothesis that cancer may be a relationship or an interaction between genetic and environmental factors. I think this has probably been my biggest accomplishment. I want to say a word about the books. I think the history of the book. David had a book that he published. It was called Cancer Epidemiology and Prevention, as I recall. And I took the lead in a book called Persons at High Risk of Cancer. David's book was oriented toward cancer sites. Mine was oriented toward risk factors. And the book that I edited came out of a workshop that we had in Key Biscayne, Florida. Those were the good old days. Really, you could go anywhere, and nobody would bat an eyelash. That was a lot of fun. But David came up to me after that and said, why don't we join forces and put out a very comprehensive book that covers all aspects, that covers descriptive epi, that talks about risk factors, talks about every cancer site known to man, and then end with a chapter on, or a section on prevention, opportunities for prevention. And so just wanted to give that little history because I think it was interesting. And working with David has been was an enormous pleasure.
How about your biggest disappointment?
I think similar to what David said, a little bit different. There's always competition, there's always turf battles, but they didn't bother me that much. It was the access to data resources that bothered me. I could never quite understand why, even within the Cancer Institute, getting access to the clinical trials data seemed to be so threatening to certain clinicians, particularly in the cooperative groups. It was a bit frustrating at times. I have a whole cabinet full of correspondence with groups that had clinical trial data, but didn't want to share it. Perhaps out of fear that we'd find something wrong with the drugs, and I don't know. But I think our program had some difficulty there that was frustrating.
Okay, this is kind of a long lead-in question here, but epidemiology is one of the few scientific disciplines where studies and/or their results can frequently threaten a vested interest, resulting in obstruction and critical attacks by such interests and their consultants. Joseph, in your career, what have been the most noteworthy such experiences?
Well,
and how did you handle them?
I think the occupational studies program really takes the cake. My first experience was a study of smelter workers heavily exposed to arsenic, and the finding of excess lung cancer. And this was challenged by various groups. And in fact, there were two other studies that preceded mine that had found no evidence of an excess of lung cancer. So this was challenged, but challenged unsuccessfully. It finally came down to a hearing at OSHA, and it became very clear at the hearing that arsenic is a carcinogen, despite the fact that there was no strong experimental evidence for this, but based on epidemiology alone, the evidence was quite compelling. But we've had so much experience with controversial studies that there's just no shortage. I listed some here: breast implants, abortion and breast cancer, number of pharmaceutical agents, radiation, electromagnetic fields and cell phones, fluoridation of water. And you can probably think of others that were very sensitive topics that led to a lot of disagreement, but that's the nature of the game, and the truth always wins out.
Yeah, David and I were talking about this as we were coming in too, and before I turn the question over to him, is that it really is true that almost everywhere else in medical research, findings are universally met with joy and advancing biology. In ours and in toxicology, every finding we have assails somebody's vested interest. So there's always somebody who is very upset, and I think it's just kind of the nature of what we do. But what has been your experience?
It's very interesting. You have to know your institutional setting when you carry out these industrial studies that are funded by industry. And I had two parts to my career. One was at a private cancer center, and it became clear to me, when you do a study and it's sponsored by a private industry, be sure you look at the membership of your board of trustees, because if they are averse to what you're doing, they're going to be more powerful than you are as an investigator. And indeed, that was an example where I was quite sobered by the antagonism toward a study that I was doing of petroleum refinery workers, which was an enormous study and could have had enormous potential, but unfortunately was not viewed with the same enthusiasm that I had for doing that study. But then when I shifted to a public university, and I did these studies with Dow Corning and did studies of breast implants, Joe mentioned, as well as chemical solvents, I had the umbrella and protection of my university and my senior position there. And it was so much to the benefit of the industry, to our graduate students, because the data we were collecting served as research content for their theses, and we were able to engage the clinical community. The breast implant story is an extremely fascinating one. And with the large funding that I had, we had many, many publications come out looking at connective tissue diseases, as well as some of the chemical solvents. So it's a little different from cancer, but in the environment of the Graduate School of Public Health, I was able to do these studies, and I was protected. I was protected really in terms of my, my academic freedom. So you have to know where you're conducting your research, where your support is, how solid it is, and recognize where you're vulnerable or where you have the support really of the leadership of your institution.
Okay, we're going to turn a little bit from reflections on the past to visions of the future here, from girded by all of this experience. So we'll go to Joe here. Over the next decade, what do you think will be the most important opportunities in cancer epidemiology to exploit?
I think the biggest opportunity is that we have in front of us is the opportunity to incorporate some of the novel technologies that are resulting from conceptual advances in molecular and metabolic sciences. We now have opportunities for high throughput developing and applying high throughput technologies that will help us in exposure assessment and in the discovery of susceptibility states. So that's the biggest. You just wanted opportunities?
Well, the next one is what are the biggest challenges to overcome?
Oh. The challenge is really the massive data sets that are going to be emerging from these projects and the informatics that's required to cope with them. And another big challenge is the policy impediments. The need for protecting privacy and confidentiality, which is important, but also complicates our life as epidemiologists in terms of access to data. And another challenge, I think, is going to be, and we're well aware of this right now, is the development of infrastructure that will allow us to carry out molecular epidemiology, the specimen collections, as well as the epidemiologic data that's required. And then, of course, big challenge of, and we're going to rely on so much on our statistical colleagues to look at gene-environment interactions and try to tease out pathways that are central to the development of cancer. Trying to figure out the role of epigenetics in all this, which may provide the answer to gene-environment interactions.
David, both the opportunities and challenges.
I certainly agree with what Joe has listed. I would also add, I think there are challenges and opportunities in looking at the dynamics of health disparities, looking at the issues relating to the multi-ethnic and racial studies that require our discipline to dissect out the determinants of these disparities in risk as well as in survival outcome or mortality. I think there are global challenges. Many opportunities are going to be there for you and investigating the cancer patterns that are quite different in different countries throughout the world that really will depend upon trained disciplines professionals, which are lacking in many of these limited resource countries. I think there'll be challenges in our being able to demonstrate efficacy of our chemopreventive interventions. Right now, I think expectations and enthusiasm has exceeded what we've truly been able to demonstrate, and I think more work will need to be done there. Now, the other was challenges to overcome. I think Joe has mentioned that. I do think one of the issues for us as a discipline, and this came about in the discussion after my talk and also in this session with the fellows, is what is the role of epidemiology in the dissemination and implementation of our research findings? Do we not have a responsibility as public health professionals to pursue translational implications of the findings and associations that we report in epidemiology? I think those are some issues.
Okay. I'm staying with you, David, for referring to the adversarial nature of some studies and vested interests that you commented on before. In your opinion, are these experiences likely to get better or worse in the future? And do you have any advice on how they might be managed better?
I can answer that very succinctly. They won't get better. They'll just look a little different. And I just think we need to stand together as a discipline and support each other, realizing that we will be targeted. And we have to overcome that because of our conviction that what we're doing is good and right.
Yeah, I think we have a special challenge at the Cancer Institute because what we do gets scrutinized much more than work that's emanating from cancer centers or universities. Because we're the Cancer Institute, because we're a national agency, and considered really the nerve center for cancer epidemiology around the country, if not around the world. The one coping mechanism that we have, and we're very fortunate to have, is when we launch a potentially controversial study, we have created expert advisory panels to review the protocols and the results, and this has helped us enormously as a sort of a safety net. We need to really, when you conduct a study, we need to be prepared for the long haul. There's going to be delays, there's going to be obstructions that are placed in front of us, and we just have to be prepared to conduct the best possible science at all stages, because that's really what stands the test of time.
Okay, there was a supplemental question I think you both are aware of, but again, kind of a long lead-in, but for quite some time there were actually, and particularly early in mid-career for you, there were strong and frequently contrasting views of which were the best chronic disease epidemiology training programs, leading to spirited debates among the graduates of different programs. And the most contentious was probably Harvard versus Hopkins, but there were plenty of other participants, North Carolina, Berkeley, Michigan, University of Washington, and others. And similarly, there were strongly held views about the so-called CDC epidemiology, both strong advocates and those that believed that it wasn't epidemiology, it was microbiology. This level of interest and passion seems to have disappeared. I rarely hear spirited arguments about where did you go and why did you go there? So historically, when young people have consulted you about where to go for training, what has been your advice, and did that change over time? And are there currently any really meaningful distinctions between training programs? Or is it, and basically, has this been a good trend or a bad trend? Who wants to start with that?
Do you want me to start with that? Yeah.
As the leader of an academic program.
Well, it is clear that in the current world, that no single department of epidemiology can encompass all the disciplines that are essential for looking at all the various disease problems that we have. That may have been possible years ago, but each department will have one or maybe more than one area of real focus and emphasis, and it will be reflected in their faculty and their resources and the research that's published. You think of Harvard, you think of cancer. In our own school, when I came there as chair, it was infectious diseases, communicable diseases. And you could go across the country as this developed, and you could say, well, this is a strength in cardiovascular, there's in diabetes, metabolic and nutritional diseases, cancer, and all. But no single department could encompass it all. We didn't have the budget for it. We couldn't recruit the faculty for it. And it was important to acknowledge that what we were doing well, and we would give some recognition of the diversity of public health problems that are disease-oriented, but that our faculty will have certain strengths. When I came there, we began to really emphasize molecular epidemiology, but then I was succeeded subsequently by a social epidemiologist, and then we built up this enormous capability in social epidemiology. Our current chair is a social epidemiologist, Anna Diaz-Rue, who's brilliant and wonderful. So your strengths change, and if I were to counsel somebody, there are a number of issues. One could be very personal, geographic, but there may be an area that they have a particular interest in, and you sort of think about faculty matching with that student's interest, because if they go into the doctoral program, you clearly need a sponsor, someone who will support that student, and the compatibility of the particular school and department and that student's interests. So it's no longer just Harvard and Hopkins and Michigan.
Joseph?
Well, our experience is really so different at NIH. Rather than departments, we have institutes, and that are categorical institutes that focus on a particular disease. In our case, cancer, but there would be benefits, I'm sure, that we could collaborate more effectively with our counterparts at other institutes. There are some barriers to that are that have to do with turf, but they can all be dealt with in one way or another. But I think if we could work more closely with epidemiologists and other scientists located elsewhere at NIH, I think we would be much better off, and it would be a much more cost-effective way of conducting business.
Just a little follow-up to that question, because I know we've discussed this with you a little bit, that part of the enthusiasm in the past has been not only for the departments, but for specific individuals. Really the Harvard-Hopkins was Liebenfeld-McMahon discussion. There actually, when I look out there today, I don't see any equivalent person known for training, known that you would go to this place because that person is there to train you. that was how I ended up where I did. I had an advisor at medical school who gave me 3 names at 3 different institutions to go visit, and it depended a little bit on what you ultimately wanted to study, but it was based on the person, and I actually don't see that right now. People who, now maybe it's because rotating chairmanships and that, you know, there's no sort of legends that stay at one place, but so do you think this is actually so, and is it a good or a bad thing? Is everybody getting good, or is there, David? Yeah.
Well, I think if you're inquiring about an institution and a department and the mentoring and the training environment, it's a good thing to speak to the students rather than to get faculty names and to get their feedback about who's teaching. Are the faculty teaching, or are the graduate student assistants teaching? How are the faculty serving to guide you in your research and your training and your career development? And that would be, I think, an important source of information rather than just going by the reputation of a person and, you know, what they've published and their eminence as an epidemiologist may not also translate to their preeminence as a mentor.
All right, in the same in the training mode here, if you had only one piece of advice to give to a young investigator starting his or her career, what would that be? Since you're warmed up, David, how about that?
Talked a little bit about that with the fellows yesterday. I think I had a really wonderful time speaking to them. It's not one piece of advice. I have a few pieces of advice.
Give me several parts. It's your show.
Some of these relate to their personal attributes and qualities and approach to their discipline. And I made the point, if you really want to be serious about it, you better acknowledge the fact that you're going to be a lifelong student, that you're going to have to continue to learn and to continue to master your methodology and to experience passion and joy while you're doing it. If you don't have it, don't trouble yourself with all the years that you're going to have to compete for funding. Also to encourage them to be questioning, to be critical observers, and ultimately, and I mentioned this to them, to think out of the box, to think imaginatively about questions, because it's framing the question that's the issue, that may be contrary to dogma, because recognizing what you teach, what you're being taught today, will be perhaps not accepted decades from now, so that you have to think of yourself as potentially innovative if you really want to be very, very successful in the field. That's tough, particularly when you're starting out, because young investigators can't be risk takers, but as you get more established, I think you might want to think about that if something doesn't seem quite right to you as you mature in your discipline. That's a body of advice I would give.
Joseph?
Well, I think finding the best possible mentor that you can have, and mentor is so important in our field. The reason I singled out Roland Rossen as having such a major influence on my life, this was the thyroidologist who had a sort of an interest in cancer, and he was able to identify traits in me that I was not aware of, or dimly aware of, and then steer me in the right direction. So finding a mentor that is caring, really caring, is important. And Also, finding compatible collaborators who have complementary skills. That I found that working, that I was so reliant upon statisticians like Nathan Mantell and others that were in our program. And also carving out a niche where you can gradually evolve and mature and become an authority in that particular field, I think is important. We don't, David and I had the luxury of entering epidemiology as really general practitioners. Since cancer was a black box, so there were all kinds of opportunities, and as long as you had the imagination and the resources to follow through on them. And we have natural experiments going on all around us, high-risk populations, and we need to seize these opportunities to study these groups. They may be in the country, or they may be in developing countries, often in developing countries. And the other thing is there's a fear, a phobia almost of young people about large-scale collaborations and consortia, and I wouldn't worry too much about them. There are always projects that are spin-offs or add-ons or something for a young investigator to carry out, and they also should be encouraged to by their mentors to play a lead role that might result in first author publications.
Okay, I'm going to give our two participants a chance to have the last word, whatever they want to say. But before I do that, maybe if there are one or two burning questions that somebody thinks they'd like them to address before we start to wind it up, I'm willing to entertain. Okay, you're going to keep us on schedule. That's good. So, David, any last thoughts you want to?
I want to thank you, Bob. I think this required a lot of soul searching, and I gave a lot of thought to your questions, and and we didn't collaborate. You know, we did not share what our thoughts were, and so that was also of interest to me. So, and I appreciate the large group here who are willing to listen to us.
Joseph?
Well, Bob, I want to thank you for, as the host of David's visit, and also for organizing this session. If I knew it was going to be videocast, I would have never done it. And so I think there are just so many opportunities still in cancer. We don't have, despite the fact that we know so much more than we did 50 years ago, there's still a lot that remains to be learned, and I hope, and I think for those of you who are in our division of epidemiology and genetics, I think the opportunities are there, and we just have to seize every opportunity that comes along. Not every opportunity, but the best and most exciting opportunities that are out there.
And I just want to thank Joe and David for this. I think, as I said, I think oral history of our discipline is important. I'm hoping that you all will go away with little nuggets that you will remember for a very long time, and help you when you're trying to tell your mentees how this discipline came about and how it evolved. I particularly want to thank you too for being so forthcoming, and And I recognize the fact that it's hard to do this, and that's why I didn't tell Joe it was going to be videotaped until I discussed yesterday that he probably wanted to wear a single colored shirt. And he said, "Why is that?" And I think by that time, I think it was too late. So, so anyway, thank you all very much for sharing.